Dr. Dennis MacDonald, thank you. I'm excited about discussing whether or not Mary Magdalene existed. There's all sorts of stuff from Dan Brown to she was a prostitute to the wife of Jesus. And there are all sorts of speculations, and that tells you that our sources are kind of funny in order to even come up with these kind of speculations, because it leaves imaginative room. And our Gospels, as we've shown many times before, have different accounts with different things. And I'm coming to you because you've made a bold claim. You've said, I don't think she existed at all. She's a fictional narrative character in a story. So let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Derek. And this may sound like throwing a wet blanket on feminist readings of the New Testament. And I don't mean it that way. I mean to be a historian. I also don't want people to think that this means that Jesus did not exist, because I'm a big advocate and have been publicly of defending the historical Jesus. And in fact, I have great admiration for what I understand Jesus represented inside of Judaism in Galilee in the first century. And I'm not arguing that the disciples did not exist. So I am not a mythicist. I do think the Jesus tradition mythologized him in order to make him competitive in the religious marketplace and to articulate the values of these growing communities that are growing alongside Judaism and Greco-Roman religion. But the issue of Judas is interesting. We talked about this in another clip. It's likely he did not exist, but there was apparently a disciple of Jesus called Judas, the son of Jacob, who became the betrayer. One also can say there probably wasn't a Simon of Cyrene, even though it's one of the few people in the New Testament we have identified with Africa. And I know this has been an important thing for African American Christians, as has the Ethiopian eunuch, who I hate to say, I guess, also never existed. So I'm not trying to say that these texts should be omitted for any sexist or racist reason, but as a historian. Now, it is curious that in the story we have of Jesus's crucifixion in Mark, we have the earliest reference to a Mary Magdalene. And it's curious in several respects. One is Jesus is buried by Joseph of Arimathea, and the tradition has it that the name of Jesus's father was Joseph. But it's not Joseph of Nazareth who buries Jesus, it's Joseph of Arimathea, and Arimathea can be understood in Greek as excellent discipleship. That is, he's carrying out the task that the disciples should have, but they didn't, and they're absent. We also have women who come to anoint Jesus for his burial and who watch him die from a distance. And ironically, two of them are named Mary. But it's not Mary of Nazareth. It's not his mother who is doing that task, but two other women who are named Mary and Salome. And in the death of Hector, there are three women who watch Hector die from a distance and then mourn him in books 22 and 24 of the Iliad. One of them is his mother, Hecuba. Another is his wife, Andromache. And another is Helen, who is the great whore of Greek antiquity. And Salome, the name, is identified in the tradition as a promiscuous woman. Now, Andromache watches her husband die from a tower, from a Porgos, or the Pergamon, and at Troy. And the name Magdalene appears only in relationship to this woman, not to a man either, and it probably refers to a Magdal, a tower. And there was a town that became called, apparently, Magdala, that had a tower, but it is Mary of Tower Town. That is, she is the Markan equivalent of Andromache, who watches her husband from a distance die. Now, we'll stay there for now, but let's go over to Paul. Paul talks about those who had visions of the risen Jesus, including himself. But he says that he received as a tradition that Jesus appeared to the disciples and to 500 people at one time. He named some of the disciples. It does not include Mary Magdalene. Now, it could be that Jesus appeared at one time to 500, but that doesn't square with the biblical account anyhow, because it's, at least in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is the first person to see the risen Jesus. Even though the beloved disciple and Peter arrive at the tomb before she sees the risen Jesus. Now, the history of Mary Magdalene is fascinating, and I think it's an important character in the mythologizing of Jesus. And you started in your earlier comments to talk about the rich literature and speculation we have about Mary Magdalene. I'm going to suggest that she never existed. Paul does not mention her as one of the people that the historical Jesus that the disciples and so on saw the risen Jesus. That's absent. Now, some people say it just shows that Paul's a misogynist. Well, I don't think he was a misogynist, but even if he were, he's trying to increase the number of people that saw the risen Jesus. So it'd been stupid to leave out Mary Magdalene, in my view.
So let's dialogue here at this point. This is great. I've read a resurrection book by Delcy Allison Jr. He thinks there's more history here, and I'm like, why would Paul leave out in the creeds the women if they're so significant in the supposed narration of being at the tomb that you think is historical? He thinks that women at the tomb is historical, and that, well, it was common burial practices were done by women and da 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 da. So in some way, he thinks there's a historical kernel. And in his book, he argues it's more what he says is androgenic or androcentric, and that it's really men focused, that Paul's more men focused in his books. But to me, if Mark is very Pauline, and it seems that Mark seems to at least riff off of Paul in some way, and we talked about this with the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, they're using Paul somewhat. I have a hard time believing if the early church is so androcentric that they would have women at a tomb in respect to this, to try and have them be the ones who verify that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, even though it's a disappointment in Mark, and it really is to blame women,
That's right.
It still gets carried on. Matthew, Luke, John, they want the women to be there. They validate the women tell, this type of stuff. Or at least they play a role in one of the Gospels, Matthew for sure. So my point is Paul leaves that out, and it's like, that's huge. That's a huge, huge thing. And if you go to the Gospel of John, if women are so viewed down and that their word means nothing in court, and like they have these apologists that run around saying that women wouldn't have. Why is it in John 4, when he speaking to a promiscuous Samaritan woman, the woman goes back into her town, tells everyone, they all believe her account, and they all start praising God and following Jesus? So like, if women's account didn't really matter, John did a damn good job of hyping up this woman's testimony of what she experienced at the well. Just saying, it's a fictional narrative, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting one.
Well, I don't think there should be any doubt that the authors of the Gospels were male, and that they had limited feminism in their blood. So I think there is a patriarchy and an androcentrism in the Gospels that we have to own. The question is, to what extent Mary Magdalene represents an exception to that androcentrism. Now, you mentioned the Gospel of Mark, so let's start there. Mark has these two women named Mary who watch from a distance and then are involved in coming to the tomb in order to anoint him, the same way that a mother might do it to her son who's died in battle. Now, the young man in the tomb says, sorry, it's too late. He's not here. He's gone before you into Galilee, and go tell his disciples, as he had told them before, that they'll meet him in Galilee. The women do not tell. So Mary Magdalene is not treated well. She and the other women are doing what the disciples should have done. They should have been around. They should have taken care of the funeral of their loved one. The father should have. Mary. So they're doing what they're stepping in for Jesus's family and disciples in doing what they should. But they are also failures. They do not tell. And the result of that may be that the Jerusalem church, in the view of Mark, suffered in the Jewish war, where they, if they had gone to Galilee, they would probably have survived. And we know of an oracle that was allegedly coming to the Christian church in Judea, telling them to flee to the mountains to avoid the carnage. And Mark is saddled with the same problem. And his solution is to blame the women. That is misogynistic. Okay. Now, the tradition has it that, let's say Mark, they do tell the disciples, and in Luke, Jesus appears to the women.
Oh, you mean Matthew?
No, Matthew. That's right. And then in Luke, Jesus appears to the women, and so on. And so there's a kind of redemption. And in the Gospel of John, it's terrific. We have Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene in this recognition scene, and it's marvelous. Sorry to say, it's not historical. It's actually a Johannine version of the road to Damascus and the revelation to Cleopas and the other disciple. And the reason the woman is chosen is she's an alternative to Agave in the Bacchae. In the Bacchae, Agave beheads her own husband and then wants to know where the body is when she gets back to Thebes. And they bring his body in, and it's without a head, because the head is on the top of the thyrsus, the wand that Agave brought into the city, thinking was the head of a lion. She'd actually beheaded her husband. And the Johannine account has it, Mary wants to know, where is my body? Where's my body? It's the same language that's used, same words. And because he's not here. And then Jesus reveals himself in this anagorismus, this recognition. So I wish Mary Magdalene existed. I also wish to be a good historian. And I just don't think there's enough evidence to say that a real woman existed. And if she did, she was not treated well in the earliest manifestation of her, that is in the Gospel of Mark. Later, the tradition wanted to make her more noble, and then she becomes Jesus's consort in some way in later tradition. And there are then Byzantine passages that talk about Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, Theotokos, having great laments for the death of Jesus. So they become extremely important in Christian imagination. But from the beginning, she was imaginary, in my view.
Wow, there's a lot there. Yeah, you definitely see the climb, and even in like Gnostic tradition and other tradition, they start to really hype her up. Peter's like, hold on, the Lord wouldn't tell some woman. There's also kind of some strange teaching that that the disciples are saying, and I can't remember if this is the Gospel of Thomas or not, but they're like, hold on, he wouldn't give this woman this insight of salvation. And Jesus kind of says, well, in the end, she'll turn into a man anyway. It's like, wow, in order to have salvation, you have to become a man no matter what. So there's some really jacked up stuff. But I thought that if we were to hypothetically say that she did exist, as you said, hypothetically, let's assume the character we have plays a fictive role, is your point. But if she did exist, she was suppressed and she was immediately, it didn't take long before she's out of the picture. Almost like if you were looking at when the death of a leader in a cult happens and they had certain connections and relationships, that's squandered after he's gone. Other powers at play like suck in and take over of the role. So it's better to assume she plays a literary character, and until you had other evidence to suggest otherwise, there's no reason of assuming out the gate that she actually existed, because she plays roles with your mimesis as well.
Well, in many respects, we agree with each other in these things. I disagree with your assessment there. Okay. The first is it's hypothetical, as you yourself know. Right. If she existed, this is what happened. And so then you said, and her memory was suppressed. I think actually she never existed, and she had her role is expanded. It's not androcentric. It's not. It actually is to increase her nobility in the tradition. So it's not a suppression of women in the Christian tradition related to Mary. It's an exaltation. So, and it goes right from the beginning. Mark creates her, and what is she doing? She and these other women are taking care of their Lord to give him a burial. Now they fail to tell the disciples, so that's a major failure. But they're doing better than the disciples themselves, right? Then Matthew comes along and makes her more noble, so the women do tell. Then as we get the Gospel of John, she's really important in the Gospel of John. Then you get the Christian Apocrypha going up to the Gospel of Nicodemus, where Mary Magdalene has these beautiful laments that come right out of the Iliad, Derek, of the women who are lamenting of Hector. So I think this business about using Mary Magdalene to say that the Christian tradition is androcentric is entirely in the opposite direction. Actually, Mary becomes a target for beautiful Christian reflection and elaboration. So if anything, there's an impulse to use the figure of Mary to talk about how noble she is. She's doing something the disciples should have. She tells the disciples in Matthew that they're supposed to meet their Lord. And so there's a vindication of Mary in the tradition, not a suppression, in my view.
You definitely made a lot of sense there. And I think you're right. I guess I was playing in my mind a hypothetical of if there was a close relationship originally, and then all of a sudden they're slamming them out the gate, Paul and Mark. You're right. I think that there is a buildup of the fiction, and the legend takes on a life of its own. Now you have Gospels of Mary. I mean, you've got like all sorts of stuff comes out of it.
That's a good example.
Yeah, and I think they're really cool, fun, fascinating, interesting dialogues.
Absolutely they are.
And so I hope people will take this stuff and enjoy. But I do like what you're saying here. I think that there are plenty of reasons to think these are characters. And if she did exist, your point is we've lost her to real history.
Yeah, that's a pity. If she existed, we lost her, and that's a pity.